What's up? Professor Wergely's here. We are looking at lecture number 8 and going to build an Angular app today. Now, in the previous lecture, I went over the slides. We didn't go over them thoroughly, so you'll definitely want to download these slides and review them. They talk about directives, components, and a lot of Angular information. In addition, Angular has a nice tutorial. Now, for the exploration, I said go over to angular.io, go over to the docs, go over getting started, and then you can select try it. And then I reference this getting started document here where they create the checkout list. Now, for the explanation, I said go ahead and go over this. I was hoping that you'd go over this whole thing, adding navigation, because in the current challenge, you need to add Angular routing. Okay, so that way you can fix the endpoints, and then managing data. In addition, they also talk about using forms. And here they talk about forms in Angular. They discuss one of the most popular ways, which is to actually use a form builder and a form group. Okay, you'll see here's the form group on the template part. And then in the back end there, you'll actually create a form group object. Okay, and then they actually talk about deploying the application. So you'll see they want you to install the Angular CLI, create a new project, and then they talk about ng build production, which is what I did in the video. And they discuss here how to take the distribution directory and put it up on a server. You can see Node.js, Java, .NET. It really doesn't matter. You can even do Firebase or Google Cloud. Okay, anything. You can host this anywhere. Angular, even though it's written in TypeScript, it gets compiled back to HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And that's the most important thing to remember. So when I said go over this documentation, I was hoping that you went over all of them. So if you haven't, if you just went over the first one, then come back here and go over all of these here. These are the most important 5 pages to read before you start making Angular apps. Once you read these 5 pages, you can go more in depth, where it talks about the main concepts and built-in features. Okay, you can go more in depth, but these 5 pages are definitely a required reading for this course. If you don't read these 5 pages, you're going to have a rough time building these Angular applications. Okay, so we're going to start. First things first, you're going to need Node. So I'm going to actually come over here to the web and just search Node or Node.js. You'll see Node.js org pops up. Current version is 12.18. It's the latest stable version. So I'm going to go ahead and download that one. You actually just download it to your machine. Okay, you can put it in your downloads folder. Open it up and go ahead and run through the installation. Okay, so you can read a little bit, save it. I'll usually save the licenses. Okay, installation type, I install it to the root user so everybody can use it, although I'm the only user on my machine. Installation is pretty quick. Okay, so it just takes a few lines. And then it says here, make sure that user local bin is in your path. So if I hover over and select this $sign path and then type it in the terminal, okay, I have quite a bit here, but you should see user local bin. Okay, if you don't see it, usually this node, this installation for Node.js will set it up for you. But if you don't see it, you need to open up either the bash RC, or for Mac, it's called the bash profile. And you'd actually add this line of code in the bash profile or in the bash RC. You'd actually add export path, user local bin, :path. Okay, one student set up Node on their machine. They said that it wasn't working when they typed in path. They couldn't see that. So we actually had to go and put this export line in their bash RC or their bash profile. Once that's in there and you type the $sign path, you should see user local bin. If you do, you're ready to go. If you don't, put it in your bash RC. Once you have Node, you can see what version you have. So you can see Node-V. You see I have 12.8. You should also have npm, which is the Node package manager. That's 6.14. And then you should install Angular. Okay, we're going to be using Angular. So I'm going to use npm, which is Node package manager. I'm going to install -g and it's going to be at Angular/CLI. Okay, let it go for a while. I actually have Angular on my machine, so I'm most likely going to run into an error. Remember, Angular is a JavaScript framework. Okay, it was created by Misco. I'm probably saying this wrong. It was created by Misco Havery, and it's maintained by Google now. Okay, so it was created by Misco, and now it's maintained by Google. Okay, so it's a really popular framework. You have two main frameworks. You have Angular and React. Okay, and in the slides, I talk a little bit about the history, how Angular JS came out. Everybody loved it. Angular 2 came out. They went to TypeScript. A lot of people didn't like that. Okay, a lot of people didn't like that. It was complicated. A lot of people didn't like TypeScript, although it's not that complicated. And so after a while, React came out. And it's kind of, when I look at React, it reminds me of Angular JS, is what it really reminds me of, although it's probably more powerful than Angular JS. Okay, especially with React Native. So anyway, learn the history, go back over the slides, make sure you understand what Angular's, what it is, and then also make sure you read those 5 pages here. Getting started, adding navigation, managing data, using forms for user input, and deploying an application. You'll see I didn't have problems there, which is surprising. Okay, usually it says that you may have one already installed. If you have one already installed, you may need to remove this user local bin ng. So if I needed to remove it, I just do a sudo rm-r to user local bin ng. Okay, students had some problems with it. It said they already had Angular CLI installed, so you would just remove this. Okay, it's pretty quick. And then you would just run this command again. Okay, now we're on the Angular CLI is actually version 10. Okay, we're on Angular version 10. As long as you have 8, 9, 10, you'll probably be okay for this class, but you might as well go and update since we're updating to Angular CLI 10. So I'll be using 10. If you use 10, it'll be easier to follow along. Okay, so I can do a ng, that's your Angular CLI, and I'll do -- version. Okay, you'll see Angular CLI, I'm on 10.1. Node is on 12.18. Okay, and it tells you the different versions. Now, if I go over to Angular CLI, there's some more documentation you should read. Now, there's 3 main functions for Angular CLI. You have ng new, which creates a new application right out of the box. It's ready to go. You have ng generate. That's how you generate components. Components are the #1 thing. Remember in the slides, routes, services, pipes, and anything else you need to create. And then you have ng serve, which is to actually test your application. So these are the 3 main commands. You'll want to know these 3 commands, and you'll probably be tested on them. Okay, so just like the example shows, I'm going to do ng new with the application. cd into it, and then you can serve it. So that's what I'm going to do here. So I have Angular already installed. I'm going to go over to VSCode now. If you don't have it, you can download it. Just type VSCode. Okay, it's Visual Studio. It's one of the most popular editors right now. Click on download, or you can also click on it right here. They have a free version, which is actually really nice. It uses IntelliSense, built-in Git commands, so many extensions, a ton of extensions that you could use. This is definitely one of the most popular code editing tools at this time. I was out in the Valley 6 months ago, and that's all they were talking about in Silicon Valley. Oh, VS Code, VS Code. Everybody's using VS Code. They may have something new now. I haven't been back in 6 months. A lot happens in 6 months, but definitely VS Code is one of the most popular editors at this time. Okay, I use it for a lot of things. I use it for my Python. I use it for my Angular apps. Use it for my Ionic apps. Just any programming language you want to do, they probably have some built-in extension that will help you write your code easier. What I really like about it here is I can open up a new terminal. So let me close this VS Code out. I'm going to open up a new one so you can see it from scratch. Okay, so let's say you go through and download it. This is what you should see. Make it full screen. I can do a new terminal, and terminal is right down here in the bottom. And it's actually my terminal on Mac. So I can do pwd, ls, cds. So I'm going to cd into my lectures directory. Okay, you should cd into your lectures directory for this class. Okay, so I'm going to make a lecture 8. So if you don't have it there, let me see what's in there. I don't think there's anything important in there. We didn't get too far in the lecture. Okay, lecture 8. Just a to-do app. So I'm going to go ahead and remove it and go ahead and create another one. So for this lecture, you want to make a directory. You'll see I'm removing it recursively, and I'm also removing it forcefully. They have some files. You have to click yes on a bunch of them because they're in the node modules. So I'm going to make a directory, lecture 8, just like I had before. Let's start fresh for this video. If you followed the lecture, you can go ahead and continue on from there, but I'm going to go ahead and start fresh for this video. And so now I have a new directory. I'm going to do ng new, just like the command tells me to do. I'm going to try to zoom in here a little bit for you. ng new, and then the app name. So I'm going to call this my to-do app. Okay, if you did at Angular /CLI, it's going to ask you for routing. For this first example, we're not going to use it. For the challenge, you will need to use it to fix the endpoints. In the next few videos, we're going to go over Angular routing. And I'm going to use Bootstrap for this one. So I'm actually going to use CSS, although for most of my applications, I will use SCSS. SCSS is kind of a mix between CSS and Sass. You can kind of do both in it. And it's kind of like CSS on steroids. So I really like SCSS. It's actually really nice. And you can use some others. But for this one, we're going to be using Bootstrap. So let's use just pure CSS. Out pops a default app. Okay, it's going to install node modules. It's going to create all these files for you. It kind of creates the skeleton. And that's actually a nice thing because it builds everything and makes it nice and neat, nice and organized for you. Okay, it may take some time. Once you have your node modules, this application becomes pretty large. Some of the applications will be 500 megabytes. I've seen apps that have images and videos in them, they get up to 1 gigabyte in size for the raw files. Okay, so wait a little bit. And then once it's done, we're going to cd into that directory and then go ahead and build an application. Okay, once it's done, you should get your success message, and you'll see it actually puts a Git repo, a local repo on your computer or on the project. So if I do an ls, you'll see the to-do app. I'll cd into it, do ls-la. You'll see it initialized a repo for you, which is nice. And it included a git ignore, which will ignore the node modules, which that's going to be the biggest part of this project is this node module. So that's also nice. Once you create the Angular application, you're going to use the CLI, which is the command line interface for everything. So you don't come over here and make a new file. You don't do that with Angular. If you need a new file, make sure you use the CLI because it actually adds everything in there for you. So if you create a component, it's going to add that into the component list. It's going to add that into the routing module. Okay, so don't create a new file and add in code yourself. If you're going to add anything into this project, you're going to do it with the CLI. So I'm going to open up this project so I can select File, Open, go to the directory that you just created. So we made Lecture 8. We made our Angular To-Do app. So you can see all the files here. I'm going to open up the To-Do app in VSCode. Okay, here it appears. Terminal closed. Go ahead and open up a new terminal. That way we can run it. So we didn't do anything. Okay, we didn't do anything. As soon as I open it up, I can do an ng serve. Let it build for a little bit. And what's nice about serving the page is it's actually kind of like a live preview. Every time I make updates to the code, you'll see it on the browser. It'll recompile, and then you'll see it on the browser. The main folder that you need to open up is the source directory. Okay, in the source, you're going to see a lot of files here. Here's a lot of extra files. Okay, these are more like configuration files. The files that you should be worried about are in the app directory. A lot of these other files you don't even change. Now the assets directory is kind of like for images, videos, data. If you have JSON data, you can put it there. Environments are more for setting whether it's production or it's development. Okay. Uh, Later we'll create a directory for the interfaces. Okay, for the types, we'll create different types. And in the app directory, here's your main component and your main module here. So this is your root module. And this, since this is just a single page, we didn't do routing. Here's your CSS, HTML, and TypeScript. So what I like about Angular is it's separated nicely into MVC. You'll have your front end, which is your view. So that's HTML and CSS. And then your controller is kind of like the TypeScript file. You can think of that as your controller. And then your data, which would be your model, can be here in the controller. In some cases, you'll have a separate file, like a JSON file, or in some cases, you'll be connecting to a database, and that will be your data set. So here you have your model and your controller. Your view and your controller. And then the model may be just a array, which is what we're going to create today, or it may actually be in another file or in a service file or in a database, but it's nicely separated. I like how Angular really separates into different pieces, okay, in your MVC pieces. You'll see it compiled successfully, and it's running on localhost on port 4200. So if I do a command click or control click, it'll actually open this up. Now this is just the default page here. You'll see it says do an ng generate component XYZ. Okay, so you always use the Angular CLI if you want to generate stuff. Today we're just going to use the main component here. In the next few videos, we'll actually build some different pages. Okay, I just want you to get a feel for this application. So in the HTML file, if I open this up, I'm actually going to zoom back down. Hopefully you can see it. The terminal is kind of small, but definitely this text is much larger. So hopefully you can see it. Let me see. Let me go back to the default size. This is the default size. So you'll see this is just a placeholder. Okay, it's the page that you're looking at. They have all the CSS here. They have all the HTML. And that's essentially what you're looking at. And actually, if you look at this example, it's just raw CSS and HTML. Okay, don't let the Angular app look big and intimidating. When I first saw Angular, I thought, oh no, what is this? I don't understand. All these separate files, TypeScript. It just kind of seemed overwhelming to me. And it's really not. Okay, it's really not. It's all HTML, CSS, JavaScript. You'll want to go over a TypeScript tutorial. They have a lot of good TypeScript tutorials. I actually posted one there in the slides. And what's nice is a lot of the tutorials will show you the JavaScript and show you the TypeScript. So if you know JavaScript, TypeScript is actually not that more complicated. Okay, it's just you specify types. So there's only a few more, I guess you'd say, functionality in TypeScript over JavaScript. Now for this form, I'm going to remove all of this. Okay, so we're going to be writing TypeScript today. So you'll definitely want to go over a TypeScript tutorial. Once you understand the TypeScript tutorial, and once you go over those 5 pages, you'll be good to go. And if you come back over this video, it'll be very clear. Okay, so if you haven't gone over those, you can stop the video now and actually go over them. That way, when I'm going over this material, you'll understand it. Okay, either way, if you watch the video now, go over the tutorials later, maybe you'll need to come back and you'll say, oh, that's what Professor Worley was talking about. That's what he was doing. I get it now. The tutorials will definitely help. So I'm just going to create an H1 here and just put hello world. So you can see when I save the file, you'll see it just recompiled down here. Now when I go back to the page, open up 4200, you'll see my H1 here. Okay, so it's literally just, think of it as HTML, CSS, and JavaScript now, just like we learned in 2830. Now I'm going to be using Bootstrap classes, and there's a few ways to add Bootstrap. I'm going to keep it the simplest way. This may not be the best way. So if I'm following documentation, we're going to do the best way later. For this video, I just want to keep it simple so you really can see how simple Angular can be. And then as we move through the course, you'll see how complicated Angular can be and how nicely formatted it can be. Okay, but for now, we're just going to keep it simple. So in this index.html, this is just a single page application. I have my doc type, my HTML tag, head, title, and body. Remember 2830? Remember the 5 required tags? Here's number 1, the doc type. Here's number 2, the HTML tag. Here's number 3, the head tag. Here's number 4, the title. And here's number 5, the body. Those are the 5 required tags. And then you need to pass the validator. Do you remember what you needed to add to pass the validator? One of them was the character set. The other one was that this title must not be empty. Okay, there must be something in the title tag. And if you had anything in the body, you needed to specify what the language was. Okay, so this page will pass the validator. And then you'll see this meta tag here. We call this the responsive meta tag. Okay, it's telling the viewport what initial scale to do, and the content will be based off the device's width. Bootstrap uses this responsive meta tag. And then you'll see up at the top, we have an icon for the title tag. Okay, which you'll see that if I go back to the page, up here I have a little A in the title tag, which is Angular. Okay, that's this favicon right here. Now, remember, this is a single page application, so all of my components will get inserted right here into app root. So it's a single page application. Let's imagine I have 3 pages. I click on page 1, it gets inserted into here. I click on page 2, page 1 gets removed, page 2 will be inserted right here. And I click on page 3. Page 2 will be removed, page 3 will be inserted right here. But you don't really talk about pages with Angular. With Angular, you're going to be talking about components. Okay, and if you go back to the slides, you'll see I had an example of a website. It had the different components. So it had the navbar component. It had the breadcrumbs. And then it had different rows. And in the rows, they had an image component. They had a title component. They had a price component. Okay, so it's nice that Angular can be very modular, and you can really separate items out into components. Okay, so you have different modules, different components, and you're going to combine all these pieces together. What's nice about that is each file will only be 10 to 20 lines. You know, I wrote an application, I have 500 users on it right now. I have probably 50 components, and each component has 10 to 20 lines, which makes it really nice. Okay, I don't write any code twice. If you remember Java and object-oriented programming, Angular 2 Plus is very similar to object-oriented programming. You want to write as little code as possible and reuse as much code as possible. Okay, which makes maintenance easier, which makes debugging easier, which makes different developers have less conflicts because it's MVC. It's just the way to go. So I'm going to be using Bootstrap. We're going to be using a Bootstrap link here. Now remember, this may not be the recommended way. I just want you to see how simple Angular actually is. I'm going to go over to Chrome, and I'm just going to search Bootstrap. Okay, and actually Bootstrap, we'll talk about that import a little bit more for that character set. So I just went to getbootstrap.com. I'm going to click on Get Started. You'll see to get started, you need to import this CSS, and this JavaScript is optional. You'll see Bootstrap is built on top of jQuery. A lot of students in 2030 say, oh, why are we learning jQuery? It's so old. No, it's not. A lot of things are built on top of jQuery, okay, including Bootstrap. Look at this starter template. This is for Bootstrap. It has the same doc type, same HTML tag as Angular, has the character set and the viewport. And then you have to include this Bootstrap link. And then inside the body, you will actually build your page. And then you'll see it has the optional JavaScript. You got to import jQuery first, then Popper, and then the Bootstrap JS. And Bootstrap JS is built on top of jQuery. And then inside, you'll usually do a div, and then you'll specify what type of container you want to use. Okay, we're going to be going over Bootstrap here in a little bit, but right now we just need this CSS link. And you'll see I'm just going to put the CSS link here actually in my Angular file. So you can see how similar it is to this template. I'm going to come up here, copy this CSS link. You'll see it's on Bootstrap 4.5, and I'm just going to paste it right here after this favicon. Okay, it's long. When I click save, I have my pretty text, so it formats it a little bit for me. But essentially, here's the Bootstrap link. So I'm going to be using Bootstrap CSS. Now, if you use carousels, other things like that, you're going to need the JavaScript package as well. Or if you use modals, you're going to need the JavaScript as well. But for here, I'm just going to be using the Bootstrap CSS classes. Now I'm going to go to my HTML file. Now remember, everything gets put here into app root. So now if I use any Bootstrap classes in any of my components, since they're going to be inserted right here, this Bootstrap link will load. Okay, it's going to load the Bootstrap link, and it's going to insert into this single page application right here into app root. So since this is imported in the index.html, any component can now use Bootstrap classes. However, they have some NPM packages. When you get really deep into Angular, you won't really change this index.html file anymore. What you'll actually do is have an NPM package. And in the next videos coming up, we'll actually install Bootstrap that way with the NPM package and use it using NPM. Okay, it's actually a little bit better to do to build Angular apps that way. But for this app, we're just going to keep it simple. So I'm going to open up my HTML file, and let's go ahead and build a component. Okay, I'm going to build a component first. We're using Bootstrap, so I'm going to pick my Bootstrap container. Okay, if you don't remember Bootstrap, you'll want to go over it a little bit so you know what's happening here. And then I'm going to have a form. Okay, I'm going to have a form, and we're not going to really fill too much in the form right now. And I'm going to have a div. I'm going to use another Bootstrap class called form group. Now, I don't have all these Bootstrap classes memorized. In fact, I need to go back over here to the Bootstrap documentation, and they have this thing called components. So if you want to see anything here, this is where I'm getting it. They have the Bootstrap layout, talks about containers. You have container and container fluid. Those are the two main ones for Bootstrap. And then if you go to components here, I'm in the forms. And you'll see here, if you do a form, you need to specify a form group. Form group will style it nice. You'll see this little kind of box around it, makes it look nice. So you put everything in a form group. So this email address is in a group. Now I'm going to do a password. It's in another group. And then I'm going to have another group for a checkbox. Okay, it just kind of formats the page nicely. And that's exactly what we're doing here. Form group, and I'm going to have an input field. Okay, so first I'm going to have an H1. And on this H1, I'm going to use another Bootstrap class. I'm going to use text center, so I don't have to write much CSS. And I'm going to use called text primary. Okay, this is just going to be called my to-do app. Okay, after the H1, we're going to have a div. Okay, this div is going to have a class called input group prepend. Okay, prepend. And then I'm actually going to have an input field. Type is text. Class is form control. This is a Bootstrap class. A lot of the classes that you see dashes in are usually Bootstrap classes. So you see form dash group, text dash center. Those are usually Bootstrap classes for CSS. And then I'm going to put a placeholder as well. Okay, I'm going to put a placeholder. And the placeholder is going to be add to do. And then I'm going to have a name for this form element, which is going to be to do. I'm going to close the input element. And last but not least, I'm going to have a span. This span, I'm going to use Bootstrap class as well. Input group text. and then this is going to be add. Okay, it's going to be add. So if I come back over here to my page and look at it, this is what we built already. So we have the title, which is primary text. If I come back to Bootstrap and I go over here to typography, where's typography? Maybe it's in content. To talk about typography, yeah, here's typography. And here I have an H1, and then we did, you'll see text muted or text lead. If I scroll down, it talks about the column system. You'll want to know about the column system for Bootstrap. I'm surprised it didn't talk about primary text. Okay, you can always do a quick search on the Bootstrap website. Primary text. Didn't have it. So let's see. Bootstrap, we're on 4.5, primary text. Looks like it's in colors, not typography. So text primary is blue, text secondary is kind of grayish color, text success is kind of green, danger, warning, info. Okay, so you'll see the different classes on there. Primary for Bootstrap is blue. Remember, Bootstrap is with Twitter. So if I go to Twitter, why is their primary text blue? Well, look at Twitter. It has a lot of blue. Okay, it has a lot of blue. So these are all primary text, all the blue elements. That's why their primary text is that Twitter blue. I call it Twitter blue. Okay, you'll see who maintains Twitter. Or not Twitter. Who maintains Bootstrap. Okay, you'll see it was renamed Twitter Blueprint to Bootstrap. Okay, here's some history. Okay, it's Twitter's Bootstrap. One of the most popular ones in the world. And that's why we're using their classes here. Okay, so this is what I have now. This is just the front end. We call this the template. In Angular, this is called the template. It's a template because it's just a component here. It's a component in the HTML file. This is my template. And this template is going to get inserted into this index.html. And that's actually what you see right now. So when I go and load the page, if I do inspect or view page source, you'll see app root. You don't see anything in here. The JavaScript will literally take that component and do an insert. So enter HTML. If you remember 2830, we did enter HTML. So if I do an inspect, look at the elements, open up the body, open up the app root, open up the div, you're going to see all the code we just wrote. So the JavaScript literally does an enter HTML and replaces the content here with this component. Now this is just the template. This is just the front end. We can actually go and add our custom styles as well, and then we can add some backend code here in the component.typescript. First, let's go ahead and add some styles here. So one, on the body, this is just CSS. This is what we learned in 2030. I'm going to add padding equal to 0, and I'm going to add margin equal to 0. In addition, on the form, I'm going to do my max width. Okay, you'll see it's kind of large there. It's going across the whole page. I want this to work on mobile too. So I'm going to do 25 EM. EM is dynamic. And I'm going to do margin 1 EM. And if I do the keyword auto on the second parameter, it's going to center everything. So if I come back, you'll see how nice this looks. Now on a desktop, there's a lot of empty white space. But on a mobile application, which will have a UI about the size of this, well, not that small, but probably like this, okay, it's going to look good. On a mobile device, it's going to look good. And that's how most of the web apps are built today. They're built mobile first. Now, here comes the Angular. So far, we've just used HTML and CSS, no Angular yet. Here comes some, and we use Bootstrap. Okay, we use Bootstrap. Here comes some Angular. I want to reference this input field later. So I'm going to add hashtag ToDo on this input field, and now Angular can access this element later. Okay, so if I go to the Angular documentation, you'll want to read about all of this. Okay, so you can literally just search hashtag input in Angular 9, or I guess we're in Angular 10, so you can search Angular 10. You'll see it talks about input fields. Okay, it talks about user input, talks about binding. Okay, that's not really what we wanted. You can even say, what's the hashtag in Angular 9 or Angular 10, whatever. You'll see in Angular 2, hashtag is a syntax used to declare DOM element as a variable. And these templates render as an HTML file. You'll see template reference variables are a little gem that allows getting a lot of nicer things done with Angular. It relies on a simple hashtag to create a reference to an element in a template. So you'll see it's called template reference variable. So if I just search Angular, template reference variable, you'll go back to the Angular docs. Always try to use the Angular docs. This is the most important thing. You'll see use the hashtag symbol to declare a reference variable. The following reference variable phone declares a phone variable on an input element. That's exactly what we're doing. And what's nice about this is later when you do a click function like call phone, you can actually pass the phone's value. And phone here is actually this hashtag phone. So I could use it in the Angular code to reference one of the HTML elements. So this is a template reference variable. Remember, template is in your HTML. We call these templates. This is a component. So the component is everything here. So app.component, so the TypeScript, the HTML, and the CSS, this makes up the component, this whole thing. And in this component, we have a template, which is this HTML file. And in this template, I have an input element that I want to use in my Angular later. I want to be able to reference this to-do list, to-do item, this to-do input field. So I add a hashtag to-do to reference it, and then I can make a click function. Okay, then I can make a click function. Okay, that way when they actually click, okay, when they click on this span, so I'm going to add it right over here. When they click, this is how you do it on click in Angular. You do parentheses click and then call the function. We're going to call an add to do method, and we're going to pass in the todos.value. Now remember, this is a DOM element. This is a DOM element. So if you remember in 2030, the DOM, we use JavaScript and the DOM API. And the DOM API, we can access the inner HTML. On a form, we can access the values of the form. So that's why you have this dot value here. We're putting a hashtag, a reference on a DOM element. Then I could use this as a variable. The to-do here is the variable. And then the dot value is the DOM element's value, which is what the user typed. So now we're starting to get into a little bit of Angular here. Okay, but see, add to do is not available. So now I need to come back here in the TypeScript, and I'm going to write this method here. So you see I have a class. Usually in the class, you'll have a constructor. We'll get into constructors here in a little bit. Right now, I'm just going to call add to do, which is a method, which takes a value. And I'm going to check that value. If the value does not equal null, then I'm going to do something. Okay, I'm going to push it to a array list. I'm going to call it a to-do array. And actually, let's go ahead and create it before we start adding to it. So right underneath the title, I'm going to add what's called a to-do array. And it's just going to be a variable. And then I just set it equal to an empty array. So here's how you create an array. And I'm not doing any types yet. So this is just regular JavaScript. Essentially, this is a TypeScript file. And TypeScript will be compiled back down to JavaScript. So at this point, I'm just writing JavaScript here. And this is the same as a JavaScript function. The only difference is I didn't type the keyword function here. In JavaScript, you would write function. Okay, in TypeScript, I don't need to. It knows it's a function based off of these parentheses. Okay, make sure you go through that TypeScript tutorial so you know what's happening here. So if the value is not equal to empty, and I did do double quotes there, I have an extension called pretty, and it is changing it to single quotes when I save the file. So when I click save, you'll see it switched. That's not me. It's okay to leave it as double. And I'll do, this is a global variable. So if you remember in Java, we did classes. Okay, we did classes. This is a field in Java. And in order to access the current field, you use the keyword this. The keyword this references the current object. And in Angular, you need to use the keyword this to reference global variables. So I'll do the keyword this, do the dot notation. I'll do the to-do array. And then I'll call, this is just JavaScript here, push. This is JavaScript method, push. I'm pushing onto the array the actual value, okay, which is just a string. Let's go ahead and print that out. Remember console log, that's from 2830. Okay, that's just JavaScript right now. We're just writing JavaScript. It's just a little bit modified version of JavaScript. And if it is empty, let's go ahead and print out a message. So I'll do an alert, and I'll just say to do field required. To do field required. Now you'll see the formatting I did. I did a new line and did it like we wrote it in Java or JavaScript. This is how we wrote it in 2830. When I save the file, you'll see it formats it this way. Okay, it's okay if your formatting looks a little bit different. In fact, I actually prefer it to be written this way. The prettier extension is actually changing my text. Okay, and I wouldn't actually mind turning that off. Let me turn that off real quick. Okay, now I installed a extension just now, which is pretty nice, formatting toggle, which will disable my prettier text. Okay, so that way our text looks the same. So now I've added this. I'm going to go ahead and see if it works. So if I come back to my page, we just have a simple input element here. I'm going to do test and hit add. If I come over here, if I do a right click on the page, do an inspect, here comes the Chrome developer tools, and go over here to the console. You'll see test is there in the array. If I do test2, click add, you see I have test and test2. So it is pushing it over to the array, which this is working. So that's good. So I have my reference variable here. And I'm referencing the variable and passing the value over to this add to do method. And now we may want to output this to this template, to this component here. So after the form, okay, after the form, I'm going to come here and I'm going to put a div. Okay, right after the form, I'm going to have a div. And let's have a class called data. Okay, we're going to have a class called data. And we're going to have an unordered list with a class called list-unstyled. This is Bootstrap here. And then for each list, I'm going to use a directive here, okay, called ng4. Make sure you're reading about this. They talk about ng4 back here in the try it. Okay, ng4 is a structural directive. Okay, so it talks about template syntax, and here's an ng4. ng4 is a structural directive. Structural directives shape or reshape the DOM structure. Remember the DOM, 2830. Typically by adding, removing, and manipulating the elements to which they are attached. Directives with an asterisk are structural directives. Okay, this is a perfect quiz question right here. You're going to see this on a quiz coming up. Essentially, it's just a for loop. It's like a JavaScript for loop, but I'm writing it right here in the HTML code. So I'm going to do an ng4, and then it's just JavaScript code. Let, that's a JavaScript variable. Let to do of to do array. So to do array is in the back end. This is why I like Angular. It has two-way binding of variables. I have this variable in the back end. I can use it on the front end. I can have a variable on the front end and use it on the back end. Now this can't be used in the back end, but if I do an ng model, which we're going to use here in a little bit, then I can use that on the back end. So this is just a for loop. Loop through the to-do array, and each item is going to be called to-do. And now we're going to end the li, and we're going to do something funny here. Okay, this is going to be weird to you. I'm going to do tuple. We call this mustaches. These are brackets, but it's also a mustache. Mustache was the first library to come out with this. It's called interpolation. So this to do, which is a variable in the back end from this to do array. So it's an element of this array. The value of it is now going to be inserted into the HTML. So this is called interpolation. Now, if I come back over here, you're going to read about interpolation. Okay, that's one of the main things here, interpolation. Okay, interpolation renders a property's value as text. Inside the div, add an H3 to display the interpolated product name. Okay, so whatever's in products, the value of that element of the array is then going to be displayed here. So I'm going to take the products.name. For us, it's not a JSON element, it's just a string. So we'll just call it to do. We'll put that string right here on the display. So I can save this, come back to the page, come back over here to the app. Okay, type in test, hit add. You'll see it here on the display. Type in test2, hit add. You'll see it get added on the display. So that ng4 is being executed immediately. Okay, two-way binding. Look how powerful this is. I've only wrote, 10 lines of code? You know how hard this would be to do in JavaScript, HTML, CSS? I've hardly written any CSS. I'm all using Bootstrap. Look how nice this page looks. Now this output doesn't look nice, but we're going to make it look nice as we continue. Okay, so this, what I wrote, 19 lines of code, and that's with a few spaces. In the TypeScript file, I wrote 20 lines of code, not even. Actually, I wrote from 13 or 11 to 21. So 10 lines of code, and in CSS, what? 10 lines of code? Wow, that's amazing. And that's why Angular is so powerful and so popular. You can make these really complicated applications with just a few lines of code. Okay, we got a lot more to add. We're going to add material icons. We're going to make this output look nice. Stick with Professor Wergeles, and we'll see you in the next video.